All right, today we're going to dig into a pretty intense text called the Ashraaf Siege. The whole thing is built around this idea of a deep, fundamental split in India. So what we're going to do is just walk through its argument piece by piece and see exactly how it's put together. So, right out of the gate, the text hits you with this. India is divided in two races, Hindu and Ashraf. Whoa. That's a huge claim, right? It sets up this binary, this two-sided conflict that really drives everything else in the text. So obviously the first thing we got to do is figure out what on earth did they mean by Hindu and Ashraf? Okay, so let's get into those definitions. The text is actually super specific about this, so it's important we get it right to understand their point of view. So interestingly, the text starts by defining Hindu in the negative. A Hindu is simply someone who isn't an Ashraf. But then it adds a couple of positive traits. First, their homeland, or what the text calls Pitri Bhumi, is India. And second, and this is a key point, they don't rely on just one source of truth or testimony, what the text calls Shabda. They use multiple ways of knowing. All right, so if that's a Hindu, according to this source, that naturally leads to the big question, the one at the heart of this whole argument: what exactly is an Ashraf? And this is where the text really draws a line in the sand. It sets up this stark comparison. On one side, you have the Hindu, defined by a connection to India as the homeland and the use of what it calls 6 pramanas, basically multiple means of understanding the world. But then on the other side, you have the Ashraf. The text claims their loyalties and origins are outside India, and their knowledge comes from just one source, the Shabda. And according to this argument, that single source reliance leads to a morality that's, well, doctored, static, and even militarist. Okay, so the text has defined the two groups of people. Now it takes the next step. It builds this into a full-blown ideology, which it labels Ashrafism. Now, the source is really careful to make a distinction here. It's not talking about the religion of Islam as a whole. Instead, it defines Ashrafism as a political doctrine, a supremacist one, in its words. It frames it as a very specific, regressive part of what it calls political Islam, with the ultimate goal being to establish rule. This is where things get even more layered. To build its case, the text introduces another group within the Muslim community, the Pasmanda. See, according to this argument, there's a huge internal division. The Ashraf are framed as this foreign origin ruling class with pure blood. But the Pasmanda? They're described as the original inhabitants of India who converted, and who, the text claims, are basically used as ideological slaves while still holding on to their inherent native Hindu values. And to back this up, the source uses these really pointed, kind of provocative examples. Take this one about the burqa. The argument being made here is that Ashrafism works through a kind of hypocrisy. A leadership class, it claims, imposes strict rules and cultural symbols on the broader Pasmanda community, rules they themselves would never follow. Okay, so we have the ideology, right? That's Ashrafism, as the source lays it out. So how does it work? How, according to this text, does it actually lay siege to what it calls the Hindu consciousness? Well, the text presents this 6-pronged framework. It calls them the Shada Shatru, or the 6 external enemies. And it claims they're all working in concert. You can see the list here: clerics, Macaulayism, Marxism, the judiciary, which it calls my lords, media, and missionaries. These 6, the argument goes, are the pillars of the siege. Now, the text really drills down on the first 3 of these alleged enemies. So let's follow that logic and break down how it builds its case for each one. So first up, the Maulana Mufti class. The text's argument here is that we should see them not as spiritual leaders, but as political ones. It claims they're engaged in a constant state of what it calls jihad, but that this is hidden behind deceptive language to mask what are, according to the source, purely political goals. The second enemy identified is something called Macaulayism. The text defines this as a kind of mental colonization left over from the British. The idea is that it created a class of people who are, Indian in blood and color, but English in tastes, in opinions. The result, the source argues, is a deep self-hatred and an active subversion of their own Hindu culture. And it doesn't stop there. The source actually lays out what it calls the 5 steps of a Mac loyalist argument. It's presented as a kind of playbook. Step 1, denial of history. Step 2, create sympathy for one group, presenting them as a deprived minority. Step 3, acrimony, painting the majority as oppressors. Step 4, concoction, saying the real problem is India's own social fabric. And it all culminates in Step 5, apologism, which the text frames as basically saying Hindus deserve their fate if they don't change. And that brings us to the third enemy, Marxism. And here the text makes a really direct comparison. It basically maps the structure of communism directly onto the structure of Islam. You've got a prophet to obey, Marx, a holy book, Das Kapital, a totalitarian goal of world control, and this fundamental division of humanity into believers and non-believers. The parallel is so direct that the text comes to this pretty stunning conclusion that communism is essentially Islam without Allah. So, building on that idea, the text argues that these two, Islam as it defines it, and communism, have formed what it calls an Islamo-communist nexus. It's presented as a partnership where each side has a specific job. One side gathers the mob and provides the sword, while the other provides the intellectual covering fire. One side grows the population, the other provides the funding. One creates anarchy, the other justifies it as class conflict. It's framed as a symbiotic relationship to fight a common enemy. So, where does this all lead? The text brings its whole argument to a head by claiming that this siege isn't just political or social. No, it claims the ultimate battleground is history itself. It's a war of narratives, a struggle to control the story of the past. And to prove this point, the text offers this as evidence. What you're looking at here is a table that, according to the source, shows official instructions for changing history textbooks in West Bengal back in 1989. For example, it alleges that where a text said Sultan Mahmud's invasion involved murder and conversion, the instruction was to delete those words. Where it mentioned the destruction of Hindu temples as aggression, the instruction was to just delete the sentence. And where it talked about Islamic law, it suggests a rewrite to soften the language. This is the source's key piece of evidence for its war of narratives claim. So let's step back for a second. The big idea here, the main takeaway from this text, is that history isn't just a set of facts about what happened. Instead, it's presented as an active, ongoing battleground, a fight for civilizational control. The source is putting forward a very specific, and you have to say, very controversial theory about how this all works. And that kind of leaves us with a final, lingering question. If we were to adopt this framework, just for a moment, and see history as a battle of narratives, what does that imply about how we learn about the past and how we form our own understanding of who we are?